CIA, who's been given a great deal of credit for his understanding and expertise, will play a role in all of this, although there's no question the CIA and the FBI will be held, at least initially, responsible, one, for not providing the information to the United States about the impending attacks that we saw today, and secondly, the inability of the FBI, the National Police Force, either to prevent it or seemingly to come up with any answers to it, at least so far.
Okay. Don't go away, Henry. I'm going to come back to you in a couple of minutes. I want your sense of what you think we should expect to hear from Bush, not only in content, but probably in length. These are critical moments for any U.S. president speaking to the nation on nights like this. In the past, we've seen short speeches, but very direct and forceful ones. We'll get your thoughts on what to expect from Bush in a few minutes, as we're about 30 minutes now away from George W. Bush's speech to the nation and therefore to the world on the events of this particular day. But seeing as we've just passed another top of the clock, 8 o'clock here in central Canada, 5 o'clock on the West Coast. We know a number of viewers are now joining us. I'm sure there isn't a viewer there who is not aware of what's happened today, the terrible actions that have been taken in the United States, both in Washington and in New York City. Hijacked aircraft slamming into the World Trade Center, knocking down both towers, the Twin Towers, the 110-story towers of that building, plus another hijacked aircraft slamming into the Pentagon building. There was a fourth aircraft hijacked. It came down in Pennsylvania. It did not hit any buildings. There was some discussion during the day that it may have been heading towards Camp David. No confirmation on that. But let's try and summarize as we look at this shot of New York City at night. On the evening of a disastrous day in that city, the whole south end of Manhattan has been evacuated. You see emergency lights flickering in some parts of the city. The rescue operation, such as it can be, is underway in the south end of Manhattan. The National Guard is moving in to patrol the streets and to take part in the emergency recovery operation that is taking place there. As we look at these scenes of New York at night, let's rewind the clock a bit. Adrienne Arsenault has been monitoring the events of the day. She takes us through what has been a horrific day.
Any warning, any suspicious package?
Before their eyes, the terror of New York just flew into their backyard. At 9:45 a.m., an explosion at the Pentagon.
And the next thing I know, there was this tremendous explosion as it hit the Pentagon. I looked right.
The military nerve center of the United States, workplace of more than 20,000 people under attack. A hijacked American Airlines 757 with 64 people on board had just left Dulles, Virginia, en route to Los Angeles. Then it changed course and crashed into the West Wing. All 5 floors collapsed.
And an enormous gap has been cut in this building.
In Florida, at an education event, the horror was just reaching the president. He left almost immediately, but not before issuing a warning.
I've ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act.
Bush, his family, and key members of his staff were taken to secure locations, kept for the most part out of the public eye. The United States military, at home and overseas, was put on the highest alert. The White House, the Capitol building, all emptied out. And by mid-morning, every federal building in Washington was evacuated, sending 250,000 people into the streets. Across town, early, unconfirmed reports of an explosion at or near the State Department. On any other day, that would be crisis enough. Here, today, it just gets added to a horrible list.
Very angry. Very angry that somebody has such callous disregard for human life.
And it would continue. Just before noon, a 4th commercial jet crashed just outside Pittsburgh. A passenger aboard the United Airlines plane had called police to report a hijacking only moments before it went down in a cornfield.
I happened to heard a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normal. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here.
By now, for the first time ever, every plane was grounded in the United States. Nothing will be flying into or out of here until at least noon Wednesday. Many of these orders from the U.S. president directly, who appeared briefly in Louisiana, shaken and livid.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
In all the panic, there were few moments to talk or think of blame. But immediately, many wondered if this was the horrific handiwork of Islamic fundamentalist and fugitive Osama bin Laden. A hastily put together news conference from Afghanistan denied any involvement.
We strongly condemn it. We want investigation to be carried out in this incident. And those
Well, unfortunately, we seem to have lost the end of that item. But Adrienne Arsenault going through the events of this day, reporting to us from Washington. A couple of things to update now on the situation from New York City as we look at the pictures live from New York tonight of the scene, an incredible scene today. It almost looks normal now when you can't see the skyline covered by the smoke and debris that's still filtering up into the air. This just looks like another normal night in New York, except no traffic in the foreground, no boats in the harbor. We're told tonight that one of the ships moving into New York Harbor right now is the USS Comfort. It's a U.S. Navy hospital ship. It's there to aid rescue effort for those who are involved in the operation around the area of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, the formerly Twin Towers, now lying in rubble. There are 4 disaster medical teams that have been sent into Manhattan to aid the wounded. 3 teams, similar teams to that, sent to the Pentagon area in the United States. There has been speculation throughout this day that the towers, which collapsed within an hour to 90 minutes after the planes hit them, fell as a result of structural damage caused by those initial hits. A number of engineers are now suggesting that it probably was not that if there was the structural damage had been so intense at that point, it would have they would have fallen fairly quickly. They're speculating that the fact that the towers fell was because of the extreme heat from the fires that were caused immediately after the aircraft hit the buildings. Obviously, that speculation at this point, but they are suggesting that the energy created from the impacts was equal to a 5 to 6 magnitude earthquake. Both those buildings had been built to sustain that level of earthquake activity. So those are suggestions on the part of some of the engineers who have been looking at today's developments. From New York, as we continue to await the arrival of the U.S. President in the room where he will be speaking to his nation and to the world. That's 22 minutes from now. George W. Bush will be speaking in Washington. We will, of course, cover that live. Helping our coverage throughout this day is a former American Airlines pilot, Captain Will Engel, who joins us now from Calgary once again. Captain Engel, I know this has been a day where you've heard a lot of different reports and suggestions of what might have happened in those last few moments on board an aircraft that has been hijacked. I think one of the, obviously, the most glaring images of the day is that second aircraft captured on video heading straight into the World Trade Center. The assumption has been all along that it would be awfully difficult to imagine any commercial pilot being still in the seat at a time like that, that he would have somehow managed to divert the aircraft from that kind of an end. Do you still feel, given everything that we've seen, that that would be impossible, that somebody else must have been in the seat?
Oh, yeah, Peter. At this point, you know, I was talking to another captain today who flies for Air Canada. Bottom line is, our goal and our mission is to fly the airplane. Hijacker, we were well trained that if a hijacker came in, put a knife to you, put a gun to you, you're going to make him take you out because he's going to be responsible for the death of your crew and your passengers. You're not going to take that responsibility. You're going to force his hand to either kill you or relinquish control back to you. One or the other. I mean, it's a tough trump card to call, but it's going to happen. You're going to force him, all right, you know, kill me because I'm not going to kill my passengers. I'm not going to kill my crew. You're going to kill me? Fine, because we're both going to die regardless if that's the case.
So when you see those pictures, there's little doubt in your mind who was in the pilot's seat in those instances.
You know, and it doesn't take an experienced pilot to fly a plane once it's airborne. You know, basically anybody can turn a steering wheel. You know, we've seen that happen when you've had incidences of pilots having a heart attack, crew members being incapacitated, other crew members come up or persons come up, take control of the aircraft, and they're talked through the procedures of landing or continuing to fly or you know, until we can get another crew member up there or someone else with more experience. So once the airplane is airborne, it's fairly simple. But you know, my gut feeling when I saw that second aircraft go into the Trade Center, it was in a dive, it was a descent, and basically I think if we had any way of zooming in and looking at that cockpit there was no life, none whatsoever.
Now, obviously, things are going to be a lot different in the skies above the United States after today.
They're going to be different all over the world after today.
What do you think is going to happen now in terms of security measures at airports around the world, certainly in the United States and the rest of North America?
Let's take everybody back to during the mid-'70s and early '70s when hijacking was kind of the fashionable thing to do. Airport security was heightened. Everyone was, you know, the security was so focused. The French, the gendarmes at Orly Field and at Paris de Gaulle were so stringent. The dogs were there over at Schiphol in Amsterdam. The focus on security was so tight that air crew members, we even had trouble getting through the system. If we were running behind or we were coming over to meet a plane, we had trouble passing through security like nobody's business. And I think that's a good thing. You know, I compliment the security that we've had in the past. You know, overall it's been excellent. We haven't had this problem. We haven't had to deal with this problem. I really look that, you know, things are going to change. What used to be, you know, you run to the airport 30 minutes before your flight, that doesn't exist anymore. We're looking at, you know, 90 minutes to a couple of hours wait. You better get ready for it because, you know, stopping off at the airport, oh, I'm going to drop my husband off, that's not going to be a 5 or 10 minute thing anymore. People are just not going to be able to see that.
Now, nobody knows what exactly happened on board all these aircraft in terms of what weapons these hijackers took on. The only indication is in one of the aircraft, the first one to hit the World Trade Center, that the hijackers were armed with these small knives. This is based on apparently a report that one of the flight attendants managed to make by phone before the impact with the Trade Center. Now, if it's one of these small plastic knives, the kind of slip-out blades that you can get at an office supply store, I mean, what kind of security can ever prevent something like that?
Oh, you can't secure against that. I mean, you go down there and you get one of these breakable knives that, you know, that slide the razor blade out there. You know, you can do all the damage in the world with that. You know, you can't. That's security. That's harm that can come from anybody. You know, and you know, unfortunately, the American people, the Canadian, you know, citizens here, you know, all across the world, our whole attitude and our whole life as we know it as being under a secure little umbrella, that's gone forever. You know, we better get ready to face, you know, increased lines for security, more stringent checks at the border, more stringent checks at the airport. You know, it's gonna delay things, but in the overall scheme of things, I think the American people, the Canadian people, the French, every person on this planet, you know, if it can stop this from happening again, they're going to accept it. Then they're going to say, great, let's do that. It might be a little bit more frustrating. And, you know, it might lead to a little bit more flared tempers at the airport. But the bottom line, Peter, is that people are willing to accept that if we don't see another World Trade Center. You know,
do you think that your former colleagues, the pilots who fly the commercial routes on this continent, are going to be demanding more, not only of their governments but their own airlines in terms of measures?
I've talked to 3 pilots today with American down in Dallas that are Dallas-based domicile, and one out of the Miami field down there. Everybody's willing to, you know, to relook this. The Allied Pilots Association, which I belong to, you know, they've already got, you know, Rich and all the group down there are already looking at ways to take to the table with American Airlines and the other carriers, say, listen, this is, you know, we've been addressing this, we've been bringing this up, here's what's happened. Same thing with the Allied, with the Allied Pilot Association. ALPA, and all the members with Delta Airlines, United Airlines, which are all members, they've had to address these issues in the past. They've looked at it. Security's always been a top key issue with us because we want to arrive alive. We want to be safe for our families as well as the crew members and the passengers we carry.
All right. Captain Engel, we appreciate your time throughout this day and your
Peter,
thoughts
it's my pleasure. And it's unfortunate it has to come to this and it has to be like this, but, I hope that, again, my prayers and my heartfelt sympathies go out to the crew members that that they'll never make another flight.
All right. Well, I think those prayers and sympathies are echoed by all those watching tonight. Thanks very much, Captain Engel. Captain Will Engel, a former American Airlines pilot who's been helping us throughout this day, trying to understand what may have been going on in those last seconds on board the aircraft that were hijacked, and two of which slammed into the World Trade Center, a third into the Pentagon, and a fourth into a field in Pennsylvania. Little has been said about that particular situation, where that plane may have been heading and what might have been happening in those last minutes in that cockpit. Perhaps in that situation, the pilot won out in the struggle for control to ensure it didn't head into an area heavily populated by people. The situation now, we're just less than a quarter of an hour away from the President of the United States speaking from the White House to his people and to the world. His reaction and his words of his planned actions over the next couple of days as to what may be happening from the United States point of view in terms of reaction to today's terrorist activity both in New York City and in Washington. This is a live shot of New York City tonight. Looks like, as we say, just any night in New York City, the bright lights of the Big Apple, but with that skyline is very different now. Usually just to the extreme right of your picture, it used to be dominated by the twin towers of the World Trade Center. They are gone now, struck by hijacked aircraft, toppled within 90 minutes, and they now lie in a pile of rubble on the ground, trapped inside the bodies of, we expect, thousands of people. The National Guard, the U.S. National Guard, is on patrol in that area now, as well as medical emergency teams, trying to deal with a situation that is almost incomprehensible. That's the situation in New York tonight. Let's try to remind you of the kind of chaos and horror that took place earlier in this day.
Right here. Stay right here. Let's go. Here it comes. Move it now. Let's go.
Better where? It's better where? Better in here. Okay. Are you okay? Go ahead in. Go ahead in. Are you okay? Okay. Okay. Is everyone okay?
Get some water. Well, I don't have any. Just fucking. I'll get some water. Go under the fire truck. Right there's the closest fire truck has water right there. You have no water?
You got water?
If you can find any of those spots, I can get you water. There's a truck right there. Let me get water out of it. They're staging a battery truck. You can get there. I'm sure they'll stage over here too. Hey, here, let me water. Get what's to the fire. There you go. Come on, hey. There's going to be explosions. Don't let it panic. Do not hit anybody as you drive.
Do we have any, done. I thought it was over.
I hope I live. She's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car. It's incredible. Okay, I'm gonna have to go find people who need help, because I don't think I'm one of them. You okay, sir? Okay. Can I just get a toot off your respirator? Yeah. Can I get a toot? I'm just getting a couple of clean breaths.
Hello, Doc.
Hey, that guy needs some oxygen. If someone can share it with him.
10-4.
Thanks. Told me just to wait here. Semi-staging area. See if I can help, so that's what I'm doing. They won't let me go any closer. No one can go in to get the people out. There's small explosions still going on. So far, I just seen some people who needed oxygen from the dust. No one trauma. Gonna go wash my eyes out. That almost made it worse. Looking north on the West Side Highway. You guys going in?
Yeah.
Come with you. You know, you might not want to get too much closer, because the more buildings could come down, then we're not going to help anybody.
All right.
I think we should. Yeah.
Where's the incident come out?
Let's just. Yeah. Okay. Let's just wait right here. Let's just station up right here, okay?
All right, Doc.
Why don't we set up? Can you hang IVs from this pole here?
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. We just heard another explosion. They're handing out gloves and masks. The consensus is it's too unsafe to go in there. Just gonna wait here until they bring some people out. I was hooked up with some firemen with some first aid stuff.
The sights and sounds of the chaotic nature of the day in New York City, just before and just after the collapse of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Much of that amateur video shot by one of the medical teams that was heading in towards the area to try and help those who had been victims of this terrible incident. Joining us on the phone now, as we once again tell you, we're about 7 or 8 minutes away from the speech by U.S. President George W. Bush, which we will, of course, be covering live and in its entirety. Joining us on the phone now from Guelph, Ontario, where he is tonight, Wesley Wark, who's from the University of Toronto, is an expert on the intelligence community. Professor Wark, my sense of this in terms of the intelligence issues surrounding this are twofold. One, there will be great debate on whether or not there was a massive failure of American intelligence services in forecasting that there was an attack being planned. that debate will carry on. But let's concentrate right now on what's likely happening within the U.S. intelligence community right now in trying to determine what happened and who's responsible. What would you suggest is going on in the intelligence community now?
Well, first of all, Peter, I think there's no doubt it was a massive intelligence failure, and this is partly why people are using the phrase that I'm sure everyone has heard so often today, 21st century Pearl Harbor. The problem the Americans face, of course, is that having suffered this massive intelligence failure, they now badly need good intelligence in order to mount some kind of retaliatory attack. It seems clear that they're going to do that. There'll be massive public pressure on the part of the American public on the president to do that. I think they're going to do it soon, but they're going to be operating. I think they're operating clearly blind. They're not sure exactly who perpetrated this act, what group or groups might have done it. What they will have is this kind of established target list and some intelligence from prior to this attack on likely terrorist infrastructure and leaders and so on. So I think that what we'll see in the near future is a kind of application of pre-existing intelligence, for good or ill, to target lists and to military counterattacks, and a ferocious hunt on the part of the intelligence community, not simply to do a kind of post-mortem on why they failed, though that will come in the future, but to try and find some strands of evidence that will give them a clearer idea of who exactly was responsible for this attack.
What kind of resources would they be monitoring or marshalling to try and determine that? I assume everything they've got, satellites, whatever, to try and overhear, listen to phone conversations, monitoring whatever they can.
Absolutely. I mean, they'll be using all the resources at their disposal, which are quite phenomenal. They'll, I'm sure, be calling on their allies, including Canada, and their allied intelligence capabilities to join in this hunt. They'll also be backtracking through their own databases and recent warnings and analyses to see if there was something that they missed, I'm sure. So this will be a massive effort, an all-out effort, and the intelligence community is now in the trenches, and they really have to do their job now and prove their worth to the government and to the people of the United States.
And I assume then the government will have to share that kind of evidence either before or immediately after any response, retaliation it takes to the rest of the world community?
I doubt it. I mean, we may be looking at a kind of repeat in the best circumstances of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Kennedy administration sent around high-level envoys to its allies to explain exactly the intelligence on which they were basing their proposed course of action. I think this is a different kind of case. I think the United States is probably prepared to go it alone, has the military resources to do that, has the anger, the frustration, the public support to do that, and they will simply be going to their allies for assistance in terms of intelligence capabilities, and possibly in the case of some allies like Britain, possibly some other NATO states for military assistance and backup support. But I don't think the Americans will have any interest whatsoever in explaining their case, or certainly not in explaining their intelligence on which their counteractions will be based. A
brief last point: should we expect anything to be possible in terms of retaliation?
I think so, yes. I think that what we're going to face in the near future is an American declaration of war on terrorism. I think the United States will take the gloves off. I think they will engage in a whole range of military actions, everything short, I'm sure, of nuclear war, short of that. But among a number of things, I think they will put aside some of the constraints in which they previously acted. They currently have a law in place that prevents them from engaging in assassinations of individuals that they believe are threats to American security. I think they'll put that law aside. I think that it'll be a ferocious counterattack.
All right. We're going to leave it there. Wesley Wark from the University of Toronto, specializing in intelligence. He joins us tonight by telephone from Guelph. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Peter. All
right. Just a couple of minutes away from George Bush's statement to the American people, which the world will be watching. Henry Jamp joins us from our bureau in the American capital. Henry, I asked you half an hour ago what we should expect, giving you some time to think about that. What do you think we should expect from George Bush?
Well, I think George W. Bush will be striving to provide leadership and credibility, and I think to a certain degree the fact that he's back in the White House from the Oval Office is going to be reassuring to the American public that indeed that he's in this together with them. There is no question that this is not a time of a politician delivering a speech to win friends to a point of view. Everybody is in this together. I think the American public's going to want to hear information, whatever there is that he can deliver, and secondly, I do agree with your previous guest that the issue of retaliation, accountability, responsibility is going to be very important. And if the president can't specify, and I'm sure he can't tonight, who is responsible for these acts, at least a promise to the people that he can deliver and will deliver very quickly to those who are responsible for today's horror.
And as you've told us already, he seems to have the support and the unity of both parties in the American political system, from the comments we've already heard from leaders in both the Democratic side and the Republican side, of course.
No question of that. There was a joint press conference on Capitol Hill, both parties' leadership there, both committed to the president. And, you know, in this country where blood rolls pretty high in political politics, there from Australia today on several occasions, the former President Bill Clinton saying this is a time to support the president, this is the time to get on his side. And when people were discussing whether he should, Mr. Bush that is, be in Washington or not, it was Bill Clinton who was saying that the president's safety was paramount and it was not a time to second guess. And that's the kind of feeling that there is there, that the president should and can count on tonight if he delivers a speech that matches those first two goals of credibility and leadership.
And an understatement, of course, I would assume, to suggest the most important speech of the president, the new president's life.
No question about it, because despite the fact that this is a day that lives in infamy, to quote many references made to Pearl Harbor, this is a day that will define, and this is the speech that may define the remainder of the president's term in office.
All right. Henry Champ joining us from Washington, and we'll get back to you, Henry, after the comments. George W. Bush, live in the White House, about to make his comments on today's events. Here he is.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices. Secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you, good night, and God bless America.
President George W. Bush speaking from the White House in an address that lasted a little less than 5 minutes. The main points in this, that the country was destined for chaos and retreat in terms of what the hijackers who crashed their aircraft in and those who were behind the plan that took place today. But that is not what happened, that the country is still strong. The foundations of a building, said President Bush, may be down, but not the foundation of America. They saw evil and they responded with the very best of America. The president suggesting that those people who are involved in the rescue effort today are very much the best of America, and those people across that country and others who are donating blood at this very hour for heading towards New York City and to Washington. In terms of who may have been behind this, no hints from the president on what the current thinking of the administration is, although he was very specific that the search is on for who's behind today's actions, that they will be brought to justice, and no distinction will be made between who committed the crime and who harbored those who committed the crime. So the remarks short and to the point from President Bush in Washington tonight, very firm in his delivery. Henry Champ joins us from Washington. Henry, did you see any hidden meaning between the words there tonight?
No, I did not. I think your assessment is absolutely right, and I think the words were there. The question of delivery is in the eye of the beholder, and I think for most people, they wanted to hear this kind of speech from the president. This is a nation that's dazed. I'm not sure Canadians can totally understand that. It would be difficult for anyone to understand outside this border. It's just the confusion and pandemonium that has existed here. I do think that the relative phrase that's going to be seized upon by the headline writers tomorrow, and indeed the listeners that were paying attention tonight, was the question, we will make no distinction between those who committed the crime and those who harbor those individuals. There has long been a deep-seated feeling in this country that there are countries that harbor terrorists. Often you hear of the Sudans, the Iraqs, the North Koreas, the Afghanistans. There's been a great deal of feeling that something should be done about that, and I think the American people will welcome those words and hope that the president, if he finds culpability, will take strong action in retaliation.
Now, I imagine there are going to be those who are expecting to hear more from George Bush in this address tonight, but I guess when you go back through the pages of speeches that were of a similar nature to this one, whether it was from Clinton, Reagan, Bush Sr., it's difficult on nights like this to say too much, especially when you don't really know exactly what you're dealing with, and it's often that speeches like this are quite short.
There's no question about that. I think brevity is a key issue here. The people want reassurances, and I think in this speech, while you may criticize the delivery is not as forceful as you might think of Teddy Roosevelt or FDR or Kennedy at his prime, things of that nature, nonetheless, the words are there, the specifics are there. The credit to the people who worked hard today to try to save lives, the sympathy and the prayer call for those who have suffered, and the promise of retaliation are exactly what had to be said. And I do believe, and it can't be and I think much can be made of this today, you get a very distinct sense here in Washington today that culpability and responsibility is not something that's been defined by the government yet, that they don't really know who has committed these crimes. It's easy, of course, to talk about Osama bin Laden or to talk about renegade states, but I have not heard on the buzz anybody talking with any kind of certainty or degree of certainty about who is actually behind this, and I think that handicaps the president and the people around him from being more forceful.
Now, there will be, as you well know, much debate about the intelligence community in the United States and whether they failed their government and their public by not having any sense of what was about to happen here today. But the immediate task at hand is to try and deal with what they can find out about who was behind what happened. Given what you know from your extensive time there in Washington, what kind of resources will they be marshaling to try and make that determination now?
Well, I'm certain that, and I don't know of today's events, but I'm certain that the instant those planes flew into the World Trade Center, some very highly sophisticated police work was underway. And I have no doubt in my mind, without knowledge of what has been learned or determined, that a great deal of information has already been compiled by the various agencies and police forces here. And I think rapidly they are coming close, or certainly down the road of identifying who was responsible. On the issue of the security, that's going to be a sore that is going to be picked at for a long time in this country. The idea that 4 planes could be hijacked without the slightest incident or identification of a single one of those hijackings from airports that are major airports, ones that had high security levels, one that were respected in this country, is something that is going to be much discussed and weigh heavily on many, many people here. A lot of people that I was talking to in this building who are Americans spent a lot of time on the phone to their children who were taken out of school early, who phoned uncertain of what was going on. There is a rattling of the family structure. There is a rattling of the personal security structure of individuals here. And those who are responsible for intelligence, I'm afraid, are going to pay a very heavy price over this next wee while explaining why they didn't know what was happening, and when things did get underway, couldn't prevent anything from happening.
All right, Henry, let's leave it there for the moment. Henry Champ from our bureau in Washington, his reaction and thoughts following the speech from President George W. Bush. From Washington, let's go to Montreal, where we're joined once again by Professor Rex Bryden from the McGill University in Montreal, an expert on security, intelligence, and terrorism matters. You watched George W. Bush. When you sift those words and parse the comments that he had to make, what are you hearing?
Well, I think that President Bush was attempting to reassure a troubled nation, a nation that has suddenly seen these attacks come out of nowhere with such devastating loss of human life. And I think he was also trying to send a signal to other countries, to the terrorists themselves, that the United States resolve was strong and that there would be an appropriate response. And I think he probably hit both of those markers. I mean, I think the speech contained sufficient elements of both. Any
hints from what he said as to what their thinking may be? I mean, as Henry mentioned, as I mentioned, one of the key phrases, they're committed to bringing people to justice, not only those who may have committed the acts, but those who are harboring them. Some may feel this is a direct look overseas towards rogue states, at least what the Americans consider rogue states on the terrorist front.
I think so, and possibly for 2 reasons. One is it has to be a very strong intelligence suspicion in the U.S. that this was Osama bin Laden who was responsible, his network responsible for these acts. And if so, the continued refusal of the government of Afghanistan to hand him over means that Bush's comments, I think, were directed in that direction. But also from a retaliatory point of view, states that support terrorism are much easier targets than the terrorists themselves. The terrorists often don't have fixed facilities. They don't hang a sign outside. They don't make themselves easy targets. Indeed, they survive as terrorists by making themselves difficult targets. States have assets. They have buildings. They have bridges. They have electrical plants. They have telephone switching systems. They have things which can actually be targeted and targeted by a military power such as the United States. And so from a retaliatory point of view, it's in many ways easier to go after the sponsors than it is to go after the individuals.
But what, in fact, does that really accomplish in the long run? Because is that not what happened in response to the embassy attacks in Africa? They went after states. They may have hit the wrong buildings, but nevertheless, that is what they were doing, as opposed to the individuals who they may have believed were directly involved.
And indeed, we had a major intelligence failure in an attack on a Sudanese pharmaceutical plant that, in fact, turned out to be a Sudanese pharmaceutical plant and not a terrorist target. If you're fortunate, if you apply the right kind of pressure, and if the political conditions are right, you can certainly get governments to back off their support for terrorist groups. And the sanctions and the pressure applied to Libya is a case in point. I mean, the Libyan government is much less in the terrorism business now than it was a decade ago as a consequence of sanctions post-Lockerbie and so forth. So it is possible. The problem is that if it's Afghanistan we're dealing with here, if that is the host, if that is the sponsor, or at least the host, Afghanistan is probably the government in the world that is least responsive to U.S. pressure, which is most insular, which least cares what the rest of the world thinks about it. And so it will be the hardest country to influence, the hardest country to punish, the hardest country to coerce or to compel into certain types of behavior.
All right. Rex Brynan joining us once again from Montreal, our studios there, and Professor Brynan is from McGill University in Montreal. We thank you once again for your time. If we can look once again live to New York, that shot of the Manhattan skyline, now obviously minus the major landmarks of that city for the past 30 years, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, both destroyed in the terrorist attack using hijacked aircraft slamming into it almost 12 hours now ago. In fact, it was exactly 12 hours ago this very minute when the first aircraft struck the first tower of the World Trade Center. As we look live into this picture now of New York City, we can tell you a number of things that are going on there right now. Up to 11,000 firefighters have responded to the attacks on the World Trade Center, with more arriving from outlying areas. Right now, they're working their way through mountains of rubble. They're still fighting fires actively in other buildings associated with the World Trade Center complex, and that is the big problem, according to emergency teams, trying to get near the rubble to save any people who may possibly have survived that tremendous explosion of the two buildings and the downing of the two buildings. They have to first get out all the fires, cap gas leaks. You can only imagine what must be going on in that immediate area. Other buildings have fallen. One 47-story building has fallen in the immediate neighborhood, and a major hotel, a Marriott hotel in that part of New York, is said to also be on the verge of collapse. There are massive emergency efforts going on still at this hour in New York, also in the area just near the Pentagon, where one of the other aircraft slammed into the Pentagon building in Washington earlier today. So the scene in New York, masked now by the night darkness, it looks quite calm in New York City right now, but in fact that is not the story. We see one of the blinking lights, obviously, of the emergency vehicles heading towards the south end of Manhattan. That will be going on throughout this night, and I'm sure for many days to come as this relief operation continues. Earlier today, the Prime Minister had comments on this terrible episode in the history of the United States. Let's review those remarks from Jean Chrétien earlier today.
As you know, it is a situation that is extremely difficult for the United States. I've been in touch with the American authorities, and I've been in touch too with the Canadian ambassador and the information about the Canadians in New York. And so far, there is nobody from Canada that's been affected. For the security, I have been in touch with the ministers and with the head of the agencies to make sure that everything was to remain secure, and we said to everybody to remain calm. I would like to thank Canadians who have kept their calm in these last 4 hours, and that we hope that the situation will come to a little bit more normality quickly. Pour moi, je pense que dans les circonstances,
I think that in these circumstances, We have to pray for the families, for American citizens, and I have assured the American authorities that Canada will do everything it can to help them in this very difficult situation, an unprecedented crisis, unprecedented for a long time.
I hope that Canadians will show their solidarity with our neighbors, and the news to come when we discover the number of people who died will be probably very tragic, and it's creating a very difficult situation around the world. So I hope that I will be able to speak later on with the President of the United States.
Prime Minister, what kind of assistance are you offering? Prime Minister, can you share with Canadians the kind of security measures that will be in effect?
But we have talked with the RCMP, with the Solicitor General and the head of the RCMP, and with the Chief of Staff and Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army. And everybody has increased the level of security everywhere. As you heard, there was some things done at the airport for security. We have welcomed the planes who had to land somewhere, and this has caused some problems at some airports. I've been in touch with the Minister of National Revenue to make sure that everything was to be done very smoothly there, and there's nothing else I can add.
Prime Minister, what kind of assistance can Canada offer?
Prime Minister Chrétien's remarks earlier today, monitoring the situation for us in Ottawa throughout this day. Of course, our senior parliamentary editor, Don Newman. Don, the Prime Minister, walk through his day for us today, because he first found out about this over breakfast with one of the First Ministers.
That's right. He was having breakfast with Lauren Calvert from Saskatchewan. They were talking about farm aid, potential farm aid for Saskatchewan. They were at 24 Sussex Drive, which is the Prime Minister's residence. He was just actually standing at the door saying goodbye to Premier Calvert when somebody touched him on the arm and said, Prime Minister, there seems to have been a plane crash in New York. And he went to the TV, turned it on, and saw there had not been one plane crash, but two plane crashes. And then all of a sudden it became clear what was going on. He then, as we heard him say there, when he was in the foyer of the House of Commons, he got in touch with the important people, like the Commissioner of the RCMP, the head of CSIS, the Solicitor General with his senior staff. And they began to try and figure out what was going on. Then, of course, they found out, wow, another plane has hit the Pentagon. And at that point, there was really, as there was everywhere, some confusion as to what they were dealing with. But by 11:30, the Prime Minister had a written statement out, and then you saw it about 2:30 this afternoon. He had those remarks, basically repeating what he had said. Now, Peter, what is going on? The Prime Minister's staff is at work tonight. The Prime Minister, we understand, is at his residence, 24 Sussex Drive. He did not go to Halifax, obviously, as was anticipated today, as he had a fundraiser there tonight, actually. He's now not going to Stockholm either on Thursday and Friday for a Third Way conference. Remember, those were started by Bill Clinton, and the first one was in Germany a couple of years ago. The second one was to be in Stockholm, not with President Bush, of course, as part of the Third Way, but anyway, that the Prime Minister not going there. No decision yet on whether or not, and maybe it'll be interesting to see if this happens at all. There is a special session of the United Nations next week, and most of the heads of government or heads of state were planning to be there. We don't know now whether that'll be on or not, given the events that transpired today. The other thing, of course, people in Ottawa are wondering now is what does come next. The very simple question, when will the airports be free to operate? It looks as though, I think you were reporting, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States, says not before noon tomorrow can planes fly in the United States. That means all of those planes that are on the tarmac across Canada, and there's something like 200 of them apparently, those planes will not be airborne at least until noon. What does that mean to Canada's airports? Can if you have a flight tomorrow, should you go to the airport? Well, you better at least watch the TV or get the radio on early to find if those flights are going, but probably not. It says the government is saying at the moment that we are monitoring the situation and we will continue to assess it, but at the moment airspace will remain restricted. That's what they're saying on that tonight. The other things, of course, we're concerned about. What does this mean to the Canada-U.S. border? What will it mean for retaliation in terms of Canada-U.S. relations? You and Henry talking about how Colin Powell might be a moderating influence, but a lot of people here saying, well, yes, but it was Colin Powell who did not want to go after the Iraqis all the way to Baghdad in the Gulf War because he did not want to lose American lives. So does that mean lives will not be put at risk? So many lives lost already. Does this mean it will be high-powered weapons, and how high-powered will they be? And I know you and Mr. Thompson were talking about even limited nuclear weapons, at least he was. So that's an issue. What would that mean to Canada? All of these things, what does this mean to the national missile defense? On the face of it, you'd think, wouldn't you, Peter, that if you can fly a plane into a building, national missile defense wasn't going to stop that. On the other hand, if Americans are even more concerned about their security, as they're obviously going to be, what does this mean to MND and NMD, and what does this mean to Canada taking part in it?
All right. Don, thanks very much. Don Newman, the CBC senior parliamentary editor, reporting from Ottawa tonight. All right. Well, we're going to take a very short break as we prepare to get our forces together for a special edition of The National, which is going to start in a couple of minutes' time. But we're going to leave you in the interim with some of the sights and sounds of what has been just an incredible day, marked by the terrible disasters in New York City and in Washington. Also in Pennsylvania, where a hijacked aircraft slammed into the ground there with the loss of life of all on board. It is still a night which continues to unfold. It's still unclear exactly what happened, why it happened, and what is going to happen next. We're on top of this story. We will continue to be throughout this night. A special edition of The National coming up in just a few moments' time. I'm Peter Mansbridge in Toronto.
3 World Financial Center, we heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know. And I don't know, everybody just doesn't know where to go. They won't let, everything is blocked off. You can't even, they're telling us to get out, but there's nowhere to go. And then I heard that another plane hit, and if you go over by there, you can see the people jumping out the window. They're jumping out the window right now. Oh, my God.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
No, I want to throw my hat in there. I don't want to hold it. Not in a cleaner in there anyway. Sorry, nobody's allowed in this area. Excuse me.
I was on the 24th floor, went up on the elevator. As soon as we got up on the elevator, we lost power on the elevator. And then we just worked our way down the stairs. But there was tons of company giving maydays. We lost tons of guys. Terrible, terrible thing. What were you able to do?
Where you at? Dude, first floor. Tell me what you saw and heard.
I had 40 people in there, explosion. There's a light flash out my window. My whole doorway to entrance in my office blew open. My office was freaking out. I just told them to calm down and get to the center of the office. Everybody was fine on my floor, and we just started heading down the stairs. I heard people were trapped in the bathroom. I ran to the bathroom. It was just blown out. I asked if anybody was in there. People weren't in there. So I started going down the steps. I heard people shouting. I stopped at like 68, and there's a woman in a wheelchair, and I got her in the strap wheelchair and just carried her down the steps and carried her down 68 floors, man. And then we got lost on the 5th.